The ʻnɑː.jər, also known as Nayar, are a group of Indian castes, described by anthropologist Kathleen Gough as not a unitary group but a named category of castes. The Nayar includes several castes and many subdivisions, not all of whom historically bore the name Nair. These people lived, and continue to live, in the area which is now the Indian state of Kerala. Their internal caste behaviours and systems are markedly different between the people in the northern and southern sections of the area, although there is not very much reliable information on those inhabiting the north. Historically, Nairs lived in large family units called tharavads that housed descendants of one common female ancestor. These family units, along with their unusual marriage customs, which are no longer practiced, have been much studied, although the detail varied from one region to the next. The main points of interest to researchers of Nair marriage customs were the existence of two particular rituals: the prepubertal thalikatu, kalyanam, and the later sambandam, and the practice of polygamy in some areas. Some Nair women also practiced hypergamy with Nambudiri Brahmins from the Malabar region. The Nair were historically involved in military conflicts in the region. Following hostilities between the Nair and the British in 1809, the British limited Nair participation in the British Indian Army. After India's independence, the Nair Brigade of the Travancore State Force was merged into the Indian Army and became a part of the 9th Battalion, Madras Regiment, the oldest battalion in the Indian Army. The serpent is worshipped by Nair families as a guardian of the clan. The worship of snakes, a Dravidian custom, is so prevalent in the area that one anthropologist notes, in no part of the world is snake worship more general than in Kerala. Serpent groves were found in the southwestern corner of nearly every Nair compound. History. Early period. The origin of the Nair is disputed. Some people think the name itself is derived from Nayar, an honorific meaning leader of the people, while others believe it stems from the community's association with the Naga cult of serpent worship. Christopher Fuller, an anthropologist, has said that it is likely that the first reference to the Nair community was made by Pliny the Elder in his Natural History, dating from 77 AD. That work describes what is probably the Malabar coast area, wherein could be found the ʻnɑː, who are shut in by the Capitalized Range, the highest of all the mountains in India. Fuller believes it probable that the ʻnɑː referred to the Nairs, and the Capitalized Range is the Western Ghats. There are large gaps in the known early history of the Kerala region, which in the 1st century AD is thought to have been governed by the Chera dynasty, and which by the late 3rd century AD had broken up, possibly as a consequence of a decline in trade with the Romans. There is no evidence of Nairs in the area during this period. Inscriptions on copper plate regarding grants of land and rights to settlements of Jewish and Christian traders, dated approximately between the 7th and 9th centuries AD, refer to Nair chiefs and soldiers from the Ernad, Valavanad, Venad and Palgat areas, as these inscriptions show the Nairs as witnesses to the agreements between those traders and the successes to the Cheras, the Perumals. It is probable that by this time the Nairs were vassal chieftains. Certainly by the 13th century, some Nairs were the rulers of small kingdoms and the Perumals had disappeared. Trade with China, which had declined for some time, began to increase once more in the 13th century, and it was during this period that two small Nair kingdoms were established. Both of these, at Cohesion and at Vernad, contained major seaports, and they expanded by taking over the inland territory of neighboring chieftains. Although trade with China once more went into decline in the 14th century, it was replaced by trade with Muslim Arabs. These traders had been visiting the area for several hundred years, but their activities increased to the point that a third Nair kingdom, based on the port of Calicut, became established. There were also small kingdoms at Waluvanad and Palghat, away from the coastline. European period. The Portuguese arrived in the area from 1498, by which time the Zamorin of Calicut had come to the fore. Arab traders had firmly established themselves at his port, and although trade still went to the ports of the other two small kingdoms, it was in relatively small amounts. Indeed, the kingdom based at Kerala.Their had split into 3 even smaller kingdoms, and the ruler of Vernad had conceded considerable powers to local chiefs within his kingdom. The Portuguese had many involvements in South India, including the support of the Paravars in a trade battle over control of the pearl fisheries of Malabar. But in the Nair kingdoms the principal interest was to obtain control of the trade in pepper. In this they followed the Muslim Arabs, whom they eventually marginalized, and they were in turn followed by the Dutch in 1683. The British and French were also active in the region now known as Kerala, the former from 1615 and the latter from 1725. These various European powers combined with one or another of the Nair rulers, fighting for control. One notable alliance was that of the Portuguese with the Kingdom of Kochi, with whom they sided in order to work against the power of the Zamorins of Calicut. Although Calicut remained the most significant of the kingdoms until the 1730s, its power was eroded and the rulers of Kochi were freed from being vassals of the Zamorins. Muslim armies from Mysore invaded and gained control of northern Kerala in 1766 and remained in power until 1792, when the East India Company finally established its preeminence throughout the entire Kerala region. By this time there were 9 small Nair kingdoms and several chiefdoms which were loosely affiliated to them. The British amalgamated 7 of those kingdoms to form Malabar district, while Kochi and Travancore were left as native states under the control of their own rulers but with advice from the British. Up to this time the Nairs had been historically a military community, who along with the Nambudiri Brahmins owned most of the land in the region. After it, they turned increasingly to administrative service. Subsequent to Indian independence from British rule, the regions of Travancore, Malabar district and Kochi became the present-day state of Kerala. It is with regard to the Nairs living in the former areas of Kochi and South Malabar, which are sometimes jointly referred to as Central Kerala, that there is the most information. That available for North Malabar is the most scant. Military history. Fuller has noted a general opinion that Nair soldiers were drawn only from the higher subdivisions of the community, but believes that these subdivisions formed numerically the vast majority of the whole Portuguese era. The Nair were involved in early regional conflicts with the Portuguese, serving on both sides of the conflict. One Nair converted to Christianity, Antonio Fernandes Chael, fought for the Portuguese side, holding several command positions, was even made a Knight of the Order of Christ prior to his death at the Battle of Sanguilaire in 1571. He was one of several thousands of Nairs who fought alongside the Portuguese after their arrival. During this period, the two parties maintained their distinctive styles, with the Nair fighting armorless with only a shield, and the Portuguese wearing steel armor to protect from sword strokes, despite the heat. During this era, the Portuguese popularized the term Nair, referring to all of the locals who fought along with them as Nair, irrespective of strata or caste. The name Nair existed prior to this merely as a title dispensed by kings to some families who had excelled in military matters. Those families, along with everyone else involved in the military, were known as Lokar. Other than this limited use of the Nair title and a general use of Lokar to describe an occupational group, There is no certainty as to what the various castes which are now categorized as Nairs were called prior to the arrival of the Portuguese Travancore units. The Travancore Nair infantry was formed in 1704 for the defense of the Maharaja Martand of armor, and distinguished themselves in battle against the Dutch at the Battle of Colachel. It was disbanded following the British takeover of Malabar after the Anglo-Mysore Wars, and the Nair were first disbanded, and later disarmed, upon which they turned to agriculture. British era. The Travancore Army became the Travancore Air Brigade in 1818 to 1819. The Nair Unit, 1st Battalion of H.H. Rane's troops, was likewise incorporated into this brigade, but the brigade served only in a police capacity until the withdrawal of the East India Company troops in 1836. In 1901, the unit was relieved of its police duties and placed under a British officer. In 1935, the Travancore Air Regiment and the Maharaja's bodyguard were fused and renamed the Travancore State Force, as part of the Indian State Forces system. There had been Hindu-Muslim clashes during the medieval period, notably the captivity of Nairs at Seringapatam, where many Hindus were kept captive or killed by Muslims under Tipu Sultan. Many more became refugees and fled to South Kerala. However, the Nairs of Travancore were able to defeat the Muslim forces in 1792 at the Third Anglo-Mysore War, a second conflict which happened during the 1920s, known as the Mupla riots, culminated in the killing of Hindu landlords, of whom were Nairs. Post-independence, two former Travancore State Army divisions, the 1st Travancore Nair Infantry and the 2nd Travancore Nair Infantry, were converted into 9th and 16th Battalions of Madras Regiment respectively. After the independence, the Nair Army from Kochi was incorporated into the 17th Battalion. Caste system. The ʻnɑː.jər Brahmins were at the top of the ritual caste hierarchy, and in that system outranked even the kings. They regarded all Nairs as Shudra. Below the ʻnɑː.jərs came the Tamil Brahmins and other later immigrants of the Brahman Varna. Beyond this, the precise ranking is subject to some difference in opinion. Kodoth has placed the Samantan caste below the Kshatriya rank but above the Nairs, but Gough considers that the Pushpagans and Chakyas, both of which were the highest ranked in the group of temple servants known as Ambalavasis, were ranked between the Brahmins and the Nairs, as were several other members of the Ambalavasi group. She also believes that some Nairs adopted the title of Samantan in order to emphasize the superiority over others in their caste. The unwillingness of the higher Varnas to engage in what they consider to be the polluting activities of industrial and commercial activity has been cited as a reason for the region's relatively limited economic development. Kerala traditions included that certain communities were not allowed within a given distance of other castes on the grounds that they would pollute the relatively higher-ranked group. For example, Dalits were prohibited within 64 feet. Likewise, a Nair could approach but not touch a ʻnɑː.jər. Origin. A theory has been proposed for the origins of the caste system in the Kerala region based on the actions of the Aryan Jains introducing such distinctions prior to the 8th century AD. This argues that the Jains needed protection when they arrived in the area and recruited sympathetic local people to provide it. These people were then distinguished from others in the local population by their occupation as protectors, with the others all being classed as outcast. The cross-disciplinary historian Syriac Pulapilli describes that this meant they were given Kshatriya functions, but only Shudra status. Thus originated the Nayars. An alternate theory states that the system was introduced by the Nambudiri Brahmins. Although Brahmin influences had existed in the area since at least the 1st century AD, there was a large influx from around the 8th century when they acted as priests, counselors and ministers to invading Aryan princes. At the time of their arrival, the non-Aboriginal local population had been converted to Buddhism by missionaries who had come from the north of India, and from Ceylon. The Brahmins used the symbiotic relationship with the invading forces to assert the beliefs and position. Buddhist temples and monasteries were either destroyed or taken over for use in Hindu practices, thus undermining the ability of the Buddhists to propagate the beliefs. The Brahmins treated almost all of those who acceded to the priestly status as Shudra, permitting only a small number to be recognized as Kshatriya, these being some of the local rulers who cooperated with them. Certainly by the 11th century, this combination of association with kings and invaders, and with the destruction or takeover of Buddhist temples, had made the Brahmins by far the largest group owning land in the region, and they were to remain so until very recent times. Their introduction of Sanskrit and the melding of it with the local Tamil language to form Malayalam was also striking. Their dominating influence was to be found in all matters: religion, politics, society, economics and culture. By the late 19th century, the caste system of Kerala had evolved to be the most complex to be found anywhere in India. There were over 500 groups represented in an elaborate structure of relationships, and the concept of ritual pollution extended not merely to untouchability but even further, to unapproachability. The system was gradually reformed to some degree, with one of those reformers, Swami Vivekananda, having observed that it represented a madhouse of castes. The usual four-tier Hindu caste system, involving the varnas of Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra, did not exist. Kshatriyas were rare and the Vaishyas were not present at all. The roles left empty by the absence of these two ritual ranks were taken to some extent by a few Nairs and by non-Hindu immigrants, respectively. Subgroups. The Nairs identify themselves as being in many subgroups, and there has been debate regarding whether these groups should be considered as subcastes, or a mixture both of those and of subdivisions. There have been several attempts to identify these various groups. Most of these were prior to the end of British governance in India, but Kathleen Gough also studied the issue in 1961. These analyses bear similarities to the Jatinianium, a Malayan work that enumerated 18 main subgroups according to occupation, including drummers, traders, coppersmiths, palanquin bearers, servants, potters and barbers, as well as ranks such as the Kiri Umanilam. Although the Jatinianium did not itself distinguish any particular subgroups as ranking higher, subsequent attempts at classification did do so, claiming the various occupations to be traditional ones and stating that only the higher-ranked groups were soldiers. Anthropologists, ethnologists and other authors believe that the last name of a Nair was a title which denoted the subgroup to which that person belonged and indicated the occupation the person pursued or was bestowed on them by a chief or king. These names included Nair itself, Karup, Menon, and Pulai. A re-evaluation of the broad system of classification took place from the late 1950s. Fuller, writing in 1975, claims that the approach to classification by use of titular names was a misconception. People could and did award themselves the titles, and on those occasions when a title was in fact bestowed, it nonetheless did not signify the subgroup. He argues that the broad outline of the subdivisions embodies, so to speak, a caste system within a caste system. Except for high-ranking priests, the Nayar subdivisions mirror all the main caste categories: high-status aristocrats, military and landed, artisans and servants, and untouchables. But this structure is ideal rather than real. M.N. Srinivas observed in 1957 that Varna has been the model to which observed facts have been fitted, and this is true not only of educated Indians, but also of sociologists to some extent. Instead of analyzing the structure of the subgroups independently, commentators had explained them inappropriately by using an existing but alien social structure. For this unsuitable methodology had come the notion that the groups were subcastes rather than subdivisions. He also argued in 1966 that some Nayars ripened into Samantans and Kshatriyas, the royal lineages of Calicut, while Uvarnad, Palgat and Kochi, for instance, although of Nayar origin, considered themselves superior in ritual rank to the Nayar subjects. Quote, that is to say, they assumed a position above the status that they were perceived as being by others. The hypothesis, proposed by writers such as Fuller and Louis Dumont, that most of the subgroups were not subcastes arises in large part because of the number of ways in which Nayars classified themselves, which far exceeded the 18 subgroups which had previously been broadly accepted. Dumont took the extreme view that the Nayars as a whole could not be defined as a caste in the traditional sense, but Fuller believed this to be unreasonable as, since the Nayars live in a caste society, they must evidently fit into the caste system at some level or another. The 1891 census of India listed a total of 128 Nayar subgroups in the Malabar region and 55 in the Kochi region, as well as a further 10 in the Madras area but outside Malabar. There were 44 listed in Travancore in the census of 1901. These designations were, however, somewhat fluid. The numbers tended to rise and fall, dependent upon which source and which research was employed. It is likely also that the figures were skewed by Nayars claiming a higher status than they actually had, which was a common practice throughout India. Data from the late 19th century and early 20th century censuses indicates that 10 of these numerous subdivisions accounted for around 90% of all Nayars, that the 5 highest ranking of these accounted for the majority, and that some of the subdivisions claimed as little as 1 member. The writer of the official report of the 1891 census, H.A. Stewart, acknowledged that some of the recorded subdivisions were in fact merely families and not subcastes, and Fuller has speculated that the single-member subdivisions were Nayars satisfying the vanity, I suppose, through the medium of the census. The revisionist argument, whose supporters also include Joan Mencher, proposes a mixed system. The larger divisions were indeed subcastes, as they demonstrated a stability of status, longevity and geographic spread. However, the smaller divisions were fluid, often relatively short-lived and narrow in geographic placement. These divisions, such as the Velutettan, Chakla and Vilakatalavan, would take titles such as Nair and Nayar in order to boost the social status, as was also the practice with other castes elsewhere, although they were often not recognized as caste members by the higher ranks and other Nayars would not marry with them. It has also been postulated that some exogamous families came together to form small divisions as a consequence of shared work experiences with, for example, a local Nambudiri and Nair chief. These groups then became an endogamous subdivision in a similar manner to developments of subdivisions in other castes elsewhere. The more subdivisions that were created, the more opportunity there was for social mobility hierarchy within the Nair community as a whole. Even the highest ranked of the Nairs, being the kings and chiefs, were no more than supereminent subdivisions of the caste, rather than the Kshatriyas and Samantans that they claimed to be. Their claims illustrated that the desires and aspirations of self-promotion applied even at the very top of the community, and this extended as far as each family refusing to admit that they had any peers in rank, although they would acknowledge those above and below them. The membership of these two subgroups was statistically insignificant, being a small fraction of 1% of the regional population, but the example of aspirational behavior which they set filtered through to the significant ranks below them. These subdivisions might adopt a new name or remove themselves from any association with a richly demeaning occupation in order to assist their aspirations. Most significantly, they adopted hypergamy and would utilize the rituals of Thalikattu Kalyaranam and Sambandham, which constituted the traditional version of a marriage ceremony, in order to advance themselves by association with higher-ranked participants and also to disassociate themselves from their existing rank and those below. Attempts to achieve caste cohesion. The Nair Service Society was founded in 1914. Nosota has described its purpose at foundation as being to liberate the community from superstition, taboo and odious custom, to establish a network of educational and welfare institutions, and to defend and advance Nair interests in the political arena. Devakar and Varghese believe the year of formation to be 1913 and argue that it was established as a reaction to perceived communal slights in Travancore. Hindu Nairs were unhappy with the prominence of the Christian community, who held a status on a par with Brahmins and whose members were elected as chairs of various official bodies during a period when the political systems were being modified. The Nairs believed Travancore to be a Hindu state. As late as 1975, the NSS still had most of its support in the central Travancore region, although it also has numerous satellite groups around the world. From its early years, when it was contending that the Nairs needed to join together if they were to become a political force, it argued that the caste members should cease referring to the traditional subdivisions and instead see themselves as a whole. Census information thereafter appears to have become unreliable on the matter of the subdivisions, in part at least because of the NSS campaign to ensure that respondents did not provide the information requested of them. The NSS also promoted marriage across the various divisions in a further attempt to promote caste cohesion, although in this instance it met with only limited success. Indeed, even in the 1970s it was likely that cross-subdivision marriage was rare generally, and this was certainly the case in the central Travancore area. It has been concluded by Fuller in 1975 that the question of what the Nair caste is, it is a large named social group with a stable status vis-a-vis other castes in Kerala. It is not, however, a solitary group, and, the efforts of the NSS notwithstanding, it is never likely to become one. The influence of the NSS both within the community and in the wider political sphere is no longer as significant as once it was. It did attempt to reassert its influence in 1973, when it established its own political party, the National Democratic Party, but this lasted only until 1977. Present day. Today, the government of India does not treat the Nair community as a single entity. It classifies some, such as the Ilathu and Swarupathu Nairs, as a forward caste, but other sections, such as the Velladathu, Vilakathala and Andhra Nairs, as other backward classes. These classifications are for the purpose of determining which groups of people in certain areas are subject to positive discrimination policies for the purposes of education and employment.